We're back and we're doing a tag. That was the definition of completely unnecessary humiliation. You're welcome. Hi guys, it's Leanne and I am back today with a tag. We haven't done a tag in a while, but here's the thing. Usually people tag me in them. I've already planned my content and then I just forget to do them. This one, on the other hand, was inspirational. I saw the questions and I was like, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do that tag and I'm going to talk about books that I never talk about at all anywhere else. This tag is called the Ride or Die tag. I was tagged by the wonderful Victoria from What Victoria Read, and the original tag is by, I believe, Ladette M, and I will leave both of those links in the description below. Although if you're not already subscribed to Victoria, what have you been doing with your time, pray tell? If it is watching my backlist, then thank you, but I will tell you that when I get comments on my really old videos, I cringe. Like, squeaky bumhole cringe. This tag has been described as a tag for people who want to talk about their favourite books but haven't yet found a smooth way to inject them into conversation. What are smooth ways? Anybody who's known me for more than 5 minutes knows that my way of injecting a book into a conversation that I'm passionate about and want you to read is, hey, hi, hello, I've read this book, you should too, I think you'll really love it. And for the record, I appreciate that, even from strangers in bookshops, and I don't talk to strangers. So for the record, if there's ever a book that you think, I love this, you should read that, bring it, give it to me. I am open for the receiving. Sometimes I hate myself. So here we go, with all books that I never talk about. Or at least hardly never, because I've talked about all of my favourites at least once. The first question is The BFF, a book that not everyone likes but that you love and you will always love because they've been with you from the beginning. The first book that really jumped into my head when I read this question was Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings. This is the first book in the Belgariad series, and this book was essentially my gateway drug to fantasy, followed up very swiftly by Soul Music by Terry Pratchett, which is not the most popular Pratchett by any means, but I absolutely adore it because it was my gateway Pratchett. Pawn of Prophecy could not be more paint-by-numbers 80s fantasy. It is about a farm boy, Garion, who is an orphan. He is being raised by his Aunt Paul on a farm where she works as the cook. One day, a bearded, wizened, sarcastic old traveller comes to the farm and tells them the story about the Reaving King and how the bloodline has gone missing, but the rumours say that one day he will return and he will save the kingdom. A few weeks later, in the dead of the night, this storyteller comes back, speaks to Aunt Paul and says, we have to go, we have to run now, he's no longer safe. And Garion is bundled up and thrown into the night, wherein he meets a huge band of companions and they go on literally a globe trot for the next 5 books to discover that Garion is not the person who he always thought he was. There's something so comforting to me about these novels. Going back to them feels like going back to friends that have just been waiting for you for a while. Also, when it comes to 80s fantasy, one of the things I think about is always cracking dialogue, like whip, smart, funny dialogue, and that is absolutely something that you will find in these books. I've just realised that you can see all of my unhaul books just staring at me over my shoulder like, save me! It's too late, you're going. Question 2 is The Long Drive, a book that you're quite happy to be stuck with because you know that you're not going to be able to move away from it for a long period of time. Think like plane and train. Alternatively, think being stuck in your house because lockdown. What are planes and trains? My first instinct for this was, of course, to cheat the system, and I was like, well, I'm going to choose this because this is technically one book, right? It's the collected novels of Nancy Mitford, which are very tongue-in-cheek, sparkling society novels set in the 40s, and they're so good. They're so snippy and sarky and like deeply hostile, and I love them. And then I was like, do you know what? Let's actually give an honest answer. What would I be doing if I was stuck on a plane or train right now apart from panicking about other people breathing on me? So I looked for one of the longest audiobooks that I had ever read and enjoyed but that I hadn't already talked about ad nauseum, and I came up with Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Marillier. This was the first book that I ever read by Juliet Marillier. This is the first book in the Seven Waters series, and Juliet Marillier writes like really rich literary fantasy with generally like a Celtic twist. This one follows follows Sorcha, who is the 7th daughter of a king, and her 6 brothers are really her only solace in the world. She doesn't really have many friends, and her mother is dead. And then her father marries a new woman, and this new woman turns out to be an evil sorceress who ensnares her 6 brothers in a curse. She gives Sorcha a choice. She can either break this curse by going on a quest and never speaking, or she can speak and be free and be opinionated, and she can doom her brothers to an eternity of this curse. It's a take on the Seven Swans fairy tale, which I didn't know anything about before I read this book, and I absolutely love it. The audiobook is phenomenal. The narrator just, she just does wonderful things. This is a great one if you're looking for a way into fantasy. If you are somebody who maybe reads a lot of classics or literary fiction, then Juliet Marilli is definitely the place to start. Question 3 is The Newcomer. What is a book that you have recently read and you cannot stop raving about? For this one, I have actually picked a book that I am currently reading. I am halfway through this book, but it has just blown the top off of my head. I can't put it down. I don't want to do anything else. I don't really want to film right now. I just want to read this book. I will absolutely talk about it more when I finish it in my tops and bottoms wrap up at the end of the month, because there is no way that it is not going to be a top. But this is When I Had a Sister by Catherine Simpson, and it is a non-fiction memoir about Catherine, and she got a phone call in 2013 to let her know that her younger sister Trisha had died at the age of 46. She had committed suicide. Nobody saw it coming, even though she had a long history with mental illness, which was not something that they talked about in their family. When Catherine goes back to the farmhouse that Trisha lived in, which was the farmhouse that they grew up in, crammed to the gunnels with old stuff from generations past that nobody ever wanted to get rid of, just layers and layers of humans in one house. She discovered that Trisha had actually kept diaries for her entire life, and when she started to read them, she discovered that her diaries told about a completely different childhood from the one that Catherine believed that they had had, a completely different life to the one that Catherine thought that Trisha led. This is one of those memoirs that just completely enfolds you as you're reading it. It almost reads like a novel because it is so beautiful, but at the same time the beautiful prose does not take away from the horror of what's happened. And it's so smart because in starting at this point where we do not know Trisha, we are doing the same as Catherine. We are peeling back all these layers of her life that she's discovering when she's in this farmhouse, surrounded by her things that she also didn't know that she owned or was interested in. And it's like an excavation. I feel like I'm on an archaeological dig to find out who Trisha was. Question 4 is The Quiet One, a book that you reach for when you need a bit of peace and quiet. I'm taking this question to be interpreted as a book that you go back to when you feel like you need to just chill and calm. A book that you return to the way that I did Illuminae when I needed to get back into reading, but I didn't want to do too much legwork and I wanted to already know the world and the characters. However, as a consummate rereader, I reread a lot of books. There are a lot of books that could have fallen into this category for me. Many of them ones that I have talked to you guys about again and again. So I've decided once again to tell you about a book that I don't know if I've ever spoken about. I mean, I last read this book in 2017, so there's a chance that I talked about it somewhere on BookTube, but hopefully that video is privated now because, like I said, cringe. This is Not the End of the World by Kate Atkinson, and it is actually one of her short story collections. You guys know that on top of breaking up with literary fiction pretty much altogether for the last little while, I don't also do very well with short story collections because short story collections are essentially a series of starting books, and I hate starting books. It's the worst part of a book. I don't like starting books. And then as soon as you finally got comfortable and you've got to know everybody in a short story, it ends and then you're left having to do it all over again and it just feels like work. Kate Atkinson's writing never feels like work, and sometimes it's a little bit weird like in this one, but that's kind of okay. This is a short story collection about the end of the world, but kind of not really about the end of the world, but kind of also about the end of the world. And it also does one of those amazing things with short story collections that I think is the reason why I love it so much, and it's because the stories actually interlink. So although they're all individual and nobody appears in anybody else's story, and they're all set in slightly different times and spaces, if you follow the first story through to the end and you read them all in order, there is a thread which ties them all together, and it's so smart. It's just so incredibly smart. The three stories that I remember the most in this are Charlene and Trudy, who are in their apartment and they are watching bombs fall very softly outside in the distance, and they're watching the world slowly perhaps end, or maybe just their world, who knows, and they're making lists, and it me, but they're making very odd lists. Then there's Arthur, whose mother is a low-key celebrity and who pretty much ignores him at all times because she's more interested in, you know, being a celebrity and making money, but she shouldn't do that for many different reasons. And then there's Meredith, who has discovered the secret to eternal life and has also perhaps discovered that myths have gone from the world. And that's very much kind of what this collection is about deep down. It's about the way that myth has quietly been erased, and it's just so good. Question 5 is The Outgoing One, a book that you love to read in public. Now, I have had many conversations in my life about what book that I am reading, because I have typically worked in workplaces with people who are not big readers, and so they are always fascinated by what I'm choosing to do other than talk to them. And really I think because my reading is so eclectic and there is not really a genre that I don't read in or won't try, I think that I always had like a different looking book with a really extremely different cover, and so it was always like, the book I've chosen, the one that I think I would most like to read in public now, is Will the Cat Eat My Eyeballs by Caitlin Doughty. I talked about this really recently in my haul at the start of the month. This was also bought for me by Victoria, so that is convenient. But I think the title of this and the cover of this might lead some people to be like, excuse me, what is that please? This is Caitlin Doughty's third book about death. Caitlin Doughty is famously a YouTuber on Ask the Mortician. She is also a crematory worker and a death worker in the American death industry, and she writes books about what she thinks should change about death and the way that we think about death and our kind of like absence when it comes to death, like her like keeping it at arm's length and trying to forget that it exists thing. And this is a compilation of all of the answers to weird questions that she's ever been asked about death. So of course there's like, will the cat eat my eyeballs, but there's also like, what happens to a body on the International Space Station if it dies. There are some hilarious illustrations in this book too, so it's well worth checking out just as an object, but this is one of my favourite ones. It's if someone is trying to sell a house, do they have to tell the buyer that someone died there? It's great. Next up there is The Guilty Pleasure, a book that you love but you don't want to justify why you love it because it's really embarrassing, and oh boy, I've got one for this. I think it's really important here to say that I don't think you should ever feel guilty about reading, and I sometimes get like friends of my mum's who will hear that I read and that I have a YouTube channel and will check it out and be like, oh, you read like really highbrow stuff, or you read like non-fiction, or you read whatever, and I only read like women's fiction or like fantasy fiction aimed at middle grade people. And I'm like, I don't care what you're reading. Literally don't care. I just want you to read. My one caveat of this, of course, is that sometimes the reason that people hate things on the internet or talk about things in a negative way on BookTube is because that book doesn't necessarily represent the views of the community that it talks about, or it's not own voices, and it's also not sensitive to the experience it's trying to portray, or the author has been found to do some like sketchy stuff. And to that I say, you can have problematic favourites as long as you educate yourself about why they're problematic and you try and seek out voices that balance that out. I will also say that there is a difference between problematic favourites and J.K. Rowling, or people who perpetrate hate speech in a community, or people who have been unequivocally proven to have done some very, very bad things to other humans. You can have problematic favourites, but let's try and not support people who actively harm communities that you care about, or you should care about if you know you're a whole and reasonable human. That's little rant out of the way. My problematic favourite that I'm going to talk about here is very aptly named, and it is Guilty Pleasures by, I even forget the author's name because I'm just like, it's Anita Blake. It's an Anita Blake book by Laurel K. Hamilton. This is an urban fantasy series all about a bounty hunter called Anita Blake, who is the very definition of the small, scrappy, extremely underdogged female characters that we got in sort of like 90s urban fantasy. They were generally snide, snippy and sarcastic, but not necessarily in a likeable way. They were always very sort of athletic and trim, but they were kick-ass, and everybody like misunderstood how powerful they were. And while on the one hand it was really good to see female leads like being kick-ass like this, it was also very reductive in that apparently you can only be a strong female if you're like slim and athletic and traditionally good looking. That being said, it was all we had at the time in the genre that I was aware of anyway, and so this series became one of those series that I was like, I love it, it's great, I will read it until the covers fall off. In fact, my books are very tattered because I've read them many times. This is also an example of the way that Christianity was used in the 90s in urban fantasy, in that it was always used to expressly point out that other people were evil, which as a non-religious person I believe is not really the purpose of Christianity. After the first couple of books, it went from being sort of the traditional urban fantasy like love triangle to being ugh. I think once you get to about book 10 in this series, which funnily enough is where my reading stopped, I tried to keep going because I love some of these characters, but it had just become Anita's harem by the end of it, and there are some very dubious consent things in these books. There are some very dubious uses of protection. There is a lot of BDSM, but not necessarily in a way that actually reflects the BDSM community. So there's a lot of stuff in these books that's like extremely problematic, but there's a lot of stuff in these books that's really fun. They read like noir detective novels. There's definitely some really good plots actually. There's a couple of plots that made me go, that's awful when I was reading them. I think if they were just mysteries as opposed to urban fantasies, they would have been great and they would have sold just as well. So this is a series that I don't talk about, like I don't ever talk about it because I don't really necessarily want to promote these books with these really outdated ideas of like feminism and like sex. But on the other hand, they hold a really nostalgic place for me, and I'm not saying that I will never read them again. That's a good example of a problematic favourite, my friends. Question 7 is The Stranger, a book that you love and wish everybody else had read so that you could talk about it. And for this one, I have picked a true crime memoir, and I have picked My Sister Millie by Gemma Dowler. I think almost everybody in the UK certainly will have heard of Millie Dowler. She was a young girl who in 2002 was abducted by a serial killer. The missing person part of Millie's story really kind of captured the consciousness of everybody at the time in the media. It became this massive story that was just, it's so intrinsically part of your life if you live in the UK. I think quite a lot of the time we see true crime memoirs, and typically they are from people who have been through some horrific experiences but who are not writers in their own right, and so they often work with ghostwriters who will either sensationalise it or will make the story seem like something that would be easily digestible in a tabloid format, and so a lot of these stories don't really get the recognition that they could. But this is a memoir that is absolutely head and shoulders above the rest in terms of the way that it is written. Gemma is an amazing writer, and she has really just opened herself up in this novel in ways that when I was reading it, I couldn't believe how honest she was being about some of the ways that she felt and some of the thoughts that went through her head. I've literally never read a true crime memoir from a family member that has ever affected me this much. So I really wish everybody had read this, especially people who read otherwise quite widely in the true crime genre and who are maybe like, oh, but true crime is fascinating. It is fascinating, but this is the kind of book that I say that you need to read because it's focused on the victims, it's not focused on the perpetrator or the crime. Question 8 is, the book was better. Here's a controversial opinion. I don't always think that that's true. I think that sometimes the adaptations of books are better suited to explore their themes and to make you feel things in a real and organic way as opposed to being manipulated to feel things. And so sometimes I actually much prefer a film adaptation than I do to the book. One example that comes to mind right now is A Simple Favour. There are one or two cases that I take some exception with, and one of those is The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters. It's about the Ayres family, who are a family who are trying to hold on to their crumbling big English estate. They've sold off whole parcels of land. The house itself is literally falling to pieces. Think the story that Downton Abbey was trying to tell you when they were telling you that these big families and the estates would have to adapt and change, and then add some ghosts. The one thing that this film did have going for it was Ruth Wilson. I love Ruth Wilson. I will watch her in anything. She's fabulous. She's amazing. She's just so incredibly smart. I just love the way that she pulls characters out and shocks you with them, even though you think you know what's coming, and yeah, she's just great. However, the rest of this was plodding. It didn't feel like it was ominous. It felt like it was inevitable. I saw things coming. Even, I mean, I know I'd read the book so I knew where the plot was going, but you would think that there would be like jump scenes, and they weren't there. The creepiest part in this entire book was not in the movie. I didn't like the actor who played Rod, the brother. He did not really seem authentic to me. He felt like he was reading a script, and also I didn't really believe the choice that they had for Dr. Faraday. I felt like they tried to sort of play on the like weaselly way that he insinuated himself into the family, as opposed to the really insidious and slow and calculated way that he does it in the book. And yeah, it was trash. Don't watch it. Read the book. Question 9 is the author. An author that you trust implicitly. You will read anything that they write, whether it's a 15-book series or a shopping list. I really loved the way this question was written because that's absolutely accurate of like a ton of people on my shelves. But I am trying to use this tag to talk about books that I don't talk about very often, which is difficult when you're talking about a favourite. So I decided to talk about a favourite that I haven't mentioned for a little while, and that is Dead Girls by Abigail Tartellin. I had to piece my copy back together to hold it up for this video, so I now have it in a death grip because it's falling apart because I've read it so much and so hard. I love this book and I love this author. This is a book that's set in the 90s, and it is about a little girl, Thera, and her best friend Billy. They are growing up with girl power and the sort of feminist movements that were coming out of the 90s. They're starting to grow up questioning why men are allowed to dictate to them the way that they are, why men are allowed to touch them the way that they are, and it's not a thing. And then Billy goes missing, and Thera will not be fobbed off by the adults who say that she just wandered off, and when her body is found, and she is found to in fact have been murdered as Thera predicted, Thera decides that she is going to go out there and she's going to find the murderer. I will note that Thera is 11 and that I would consider this book to come under the mantle of creepy child narrators, but in an awesome, twisty, different way. Abigail Tartellin has also written 2 other YA novels, Golden Boy and Flick, and I don't care what she writes. I will read anything. I will say, full disclaimer here, this is one of those magical book stories in that when I reviewed this, Abigail Tartellin actually got in touch with me and was like, thank you for like the eloquent review, I really appreciated it. And after that we talked non-stop, and I now feel like I would consider her to be a friend. So that's something to note when I say this. I cannot also say the same about like Terry Pratchett or Leanne Moriarty or Jane Harper. But I just... And finally, question 10 is the tubers. Tag the people who you want to do this tag, who you consider to be your ride or dies. I have got a few of those people because my booktube experience with making friends has been absolutely charmed. And there are a bunch of people who I consider to be close friends who I would never have met had it not been for this wonderful platform. The amazing Jean from Jean's Bookish Thoughts. Jean and I have been friends for like, I don't know, 6 or 7 years, girl? I don't know how long it's been. It's been a very long time. We are both Scottish booktubers. I was delighted to find Jean when I like stumbled over her channel way back at the start of my booktube journey. I love the passion that Jean puts into everything in her life. I mean literally everything in her life. But her book reviews are just unironically sparkling. Like, I look at them and I'm just like, okay, I'll buy that book. I'll buy it, girl. And I mean, she really is responsible for a lot of this mess behind me. Next up is April from Getting Hooga With It. I don't think April really knows how much she means to me. When it comes to watching her videos, I really feel like I've stepped outside of myself and I am sitting in a quiet space with a friend and we're just talking about books. I appreciate so much her honesty and her candour with her personal journey, and when I listen to her talk about books I can almost feel the emotions that she felt when she was reading those books, and that's really special for me. And finally we have the illustrious Emma from Drinking by My Shelf. I've known Emma for a couple of years now, but I think we've only really got closer in the last sort of year or so, and I wouldn't swap her for anything. She is one of the most charismatic, outgoing and emphatic individuals I have ever met. When she's passionate about something, you will know about it. But she also, and I don't think she realises this, she has this really curious way of being vulnerable at the same time, and I think she doesn't realise that because she has such like a vivacious personality and she's so loud and out there, but she has like a little like quiet, unsure of herself sometimes centre that is just, it's just really endearing. Guys, I want you to do this tag and I'm gonna go cry about how awesome you all are now, okay? Okay, goodbye. In all seriousness, we are at the end of the tag. I hope that you have enjoyed this. I feel like tags are having a bit of a revival on BookTube right now, and I'm really enjoying that because some of them are like so creative. It's not just like pick a book with red on the cover and tell us about it. Although apparently I could have done that too, who knows. So as always, if you have read any of the books below, then please tell me about it in the comments. I would like to know. Equally, if you have read and not liked any of the books below, you know, you can tell me about that too, because opinions live here. I don't say this at all ever, but I keep getting told off for being bad at self-promotion, so I'm trying really hard. If you liked this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I will speak to you all very soon. Goodbye.